Um, so tell me a little bit about the work that you did with Mike Oldfield.
Well, I met him in 1979, and he was looking for a touring band, and yeah,
How,
so
how old were you at this
I
time?
was about 24, I think, in 1979, and I auditioned for him, and I got the job as touring musician with him, and it was a um, it was a big tour. It was the first time he'd got the guts to go get out and tour, and so and it was like 40-piece band or something like that. So I was one of two keyboard players and an orchestra and girls choir and God knows what else. And so and I did eventually 7 tours with him, but the first one was like a European one, and so I played keyboards for him, and I realised this is my sort of big break, and I'd admired Oldfield a great deal since I heard Tubular Bells, because like that was eight. I mean, he did it in Tubular Bells in '72 or something like that, when I was pretty young, and I was very impressed by the fact that he played practically everything. And being a bit of a megalomaniac, I really wanted to try that myself. You just write music that I did everything. It's part of being a small person that you want to make a big sound. And so I admired him, and I realised that it was a big opportunity, and it would put me on a you know really professional footing. And so I really went for the audition. I practiced for weeks and weeks. I got all his albums and wrote them all down in chord form and learnt them and memorised like the third side of Incantations, which was the album that he just released, which was a very challenging sort of album. It was in funny time signatures, and it was quite an adventure for. And I've been brought up as a classical musician, so it was more challenging than rock and roll, which I saw. I wasn't exactly snobbish about it. I saw it as a sort of, the pop was a necessity. That classical music at that point was much more interesting, because it was about exploration of melodies and chords and things like that, and whereas rock and roll was just an exploration of 3 or 4 chords, which I found interesting enough. But I thought that Oldfield was pretty interesting, because he did very challenging stuff, and his music was difficult to play, and although it was relatively easy to listen to. And so I went on tour with them, and that went well, and then he honed down the band from 40 to 12, and I was in that lineup with 2 keyboard players, and then down to 7 I was the only keyboard player. And by this time I was pretty much the MD of, because I was playing all the keyboards and playing bass pedals, and I made it my job to know what everybody was doing in the band. So I knew at all points what the guitar and the bass and everything. So if ever anything sort of broke up, I could always provide some of the company on piano. And at the time, I only played piano. I didn't own any other keyboards, and so so I made sure that I could play it well enough to keep things going. And then I learnt how to play synthesizers with Oldfield, because previous to that you had to hire them in studios, and you didn't get to know. You don't get to know an instrument until you own one, really. And so I played with him for a bit, and I think I'd only done 1 tour with Oldfield when Tom Newman introduced me to TV Smith and the Adverts and Therefore Cast of Thousands. Yeah, well, I mean, I knew Tom very well, and so and he dragged me along to all sorts of things. So I play, and I do him favours on this, and he do me favours on that, and and I was always at his studio, because we recorded Adverts together. My best friend was the chief engineer there, and so I was always in and out of that studio. And so I was always, spending time with Tom and drinking with him in the Warwick Castle. And he was a lovely man and a lovely mate, and time with him was always quality time. And he was a great producer. He was the sort of producer. There's 2 sorts of producers. I mean, the 2 extremes producers is the Svengali one, that tells you exactly what to do and even gives you notes, and tells you exactly how to do it and conducts you and all the rest of it. And there's the other sort, which was Tom, where he would like give you some idea of it. And I mean, I remember working with Doll by Doll, where Jackie Levin just gave me a Victorian print, and said, okay, I want you to look at this and think about what it means, and then play the number. And at the time I thought, well, this is just pretentious bullshit. I mean, the chords are A, D, E, G, and they want it pretty loud and aggressive, and I can do that. And I mean, I did take it in because I was welcome to the experience, but I couldn't help thinking we're only talking a few handfuls of relatively simple chords done in a fairly aggressive fashion, and so you know. But I like that sort of thing, and Tom was always very, very enthusiastic. He'd be recording something and he'd go, "Yeah, mate, Tim, yeah, come on, man," and he was just like geared you up. I heard somewhere that Julie Garland used to love people standing on the side of the stage and shouting at her, and and Tom was a great example. He was such an enabler and facilitator, and he never tell you the chords. I mean, he didn't need to. I could write them down in the time that it took to play the tune, so I didn't need somebody to tell me the chords. But someone to like vibe me up and make me feel that I was doing the right thing was important and very useful, and he was a great enabler like that. And so I mean, people have said, do you think Cast of Thousands is a bad second album, and whether he was miscast as producer? Now, there's several things you can say about that. And firstly, everybody's second album is deemed to be an absolute failure by the press. I mean, they build you up and they fanfare how good the first album was, and they absolutely castigate the second album because it's they build you up and they slag you off, and so that's inevitable in the first place. And the guitar sounds aren't the same, and there is no second Gary Gilmore's eyes on the Cast of Thousands. He didn't write another song about a murderer who donated. I mean, good for him. But I thought the songs are strong. I mean, I listened to it this morning, just to refresh myself on it, and I squirmed a little when I heard my own parts. I mean, I really wanted to do everything on that album. So it's great sort of thundering keyboards and everything like that. But I wanted to give value, so more notes, faster stuff, and I can see it's quite pompous and classically based and everything like that. But they encouraged me to do that, and it was. One has to move on from the first album, and you have when they didn't use the same producer, John Leckie was it the first producer, whatever, and chose Tom. Well, I can't complain with that outcome because I wouldn't have met TV if it hadn't been for Tom, and I thought that he brought it on sort of quite well. I mean, it's got flaws, but they've all got flaws. Really, and I thought it was great songs now, like Television's Over. I mean, musically, I found that a fantastic song, and I think the production on that was, incredibly good. And some of it, I mean, it's like Cast of Thousands itself, and I mean, even stuff like I Will Walk You Home. I mean, thing is that TV's moved on every time with every album, but there are elements from the first album to the present day, which are always going to be chosen topics and favourite subjects and similar melancholies or similar angers, because we all go through similar emotions, refined as we go through life, but we still feel the same frustrations and angers, and we still express ourselves in similar ways, and we find different ways of expressing it, but I think it's only too easy to take a second album belonging to anyone and say, fucking hell, he's completely lost it this time. He really, he doesn't know what he's doing. This was wonderful. This is shit. Because it's not, there can be no comparison. There's got to be a bit of progress. And of course, the other point is that it takes, you spend your lifetime writing the first album, and you've got to write the second album in 6 months, generally speaking. And so all these precious ideas that you have, suddenly you've got to come up with the same goods to a hostile press and possibly public. And the public, no one is more conservative than the public. They love something, they want it again, So it's Crossing the Red Sea Part 2, and I find it bizarre the extent to which people buy into it. Like I couldn't. I mean, like Tubular Bells Part 2, Tubular Bells Boxed, Tubular Bells Part 3. I couldn't believe that he would steep so, low as Part 3 of what, I mean, it was a great idea 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, but Christ almighty, if he hadn't got anything more to say on the subject, then he should bloody shut up. Anyway, well, obviously when I arrived, there was bass and drums and vocals and guitars, and that was it. And obviously the guitars were fairly predominant. When I put my things on it, that became more the issue, and I don't know how conscious this was, or it was a new sound for TV, or this is the way that Tom worked, and Tom is more of an impressionist producer. He likes layers and layers and layers of things. Where I think John Leckie was much more punk driven. That you should only hear 4 or 5 noises at once, whereas Tom was, is a sophisticated producer, possibly too sophisticated, and he'd worked with Mike Oldfield, and so there's layers and layers and layers, and you used all the 24 tracks available, and then you bounced and you did all sorts of things, and so not only the keyboard's very prominent in our album, but also there's an awful lot of, there's tons and tons of vocals that are pretty, obviously in Cast of Thousands and Television's Over and things like that. There's lots of vocals. Now, I can't remember offhand whether I was partially responsible for this or not. In some ways, when I listened back to it, it sounds like I might have been, because I've always been quite good at helping people arrange vocals. And I think it would be fairly unusual for me not to have put my oar in when it comes to like piling on vocals and piling on vocals, and I was good at explaining to people, and TV and everyone else, how to do harmonies and so on, and so. And Tom would have facilitated me to do this, and so when I can't remember offhand, because I can't remember the sessions specifically when it comes to vocal sessions, but I think it's listening to it. It sounds like I got slightly my hand in the actual vocal arrangements. I know that I have helped TV ever since, and so it seems quite likely, and probably the novelty of having loads and loads of vocals, particularly on an album called Cast of Thousands, would be, attractive to TV, because he was building this gothic album up, or that's how I saw it, and it was about large things, and so I don't think it was a conscious decision by Tom or anyone else that the guitars should become muddied or lost or lower than anything else. I think it's just that everything else found precedence in that, and it's a mistake I've done myself on a number of occasions, that you recorded a lot of things, a lot of parts, and the original stuff goes, it gets buried, because you put layers and layers and layers, and everybody's more interested in the stuff that took you a lot of time to organise, and so like the backing vocals became very, very loud, and so did the keyboards, because there was a bit of novelty value, and TV was impressed by what I'd done maybe. And Tom was used to working with me and liked what I was doing. I mean, I'm not trying to vindicate myself. It wasn't. I mean, obviously, I was a total megalomaniac at the time, so obviously, I would have been very pleased about the keyboards being very loud and me having a big part in it and so on. But I wasn't producing that album, and so it was up to them to decide how they wanted it. But I just gathered they just liked what I did and decided to have it fairly loud. And listening back to it, yeah, and also listening to both albums, I suppose you could say that it is a little bit grungy in comparison, and there is this sort of youth and vitality about the first album, which is maybe slightly lacking, and I can take personal responsibility for that. Fuck it, I did my best at the time.